And welcome once again to Inside Creative Writing. I'm Robert Olin Butler, and I'm speaking to you from my office at Florida State University, where I teach creative writing. And I welcome you to the fourth evening of this project that we've begun to create a short story which has literary, artistic ambition on the web through this webcast, totally from scratch. We began with nothing but a picture postcard several nights ago, and we're creating this story. I'm creating the story moment to moment in real time before you, showing every comma stroke. Now, if you've been with me in other evenings, a little of this procedural stuff you've heard before. But if you're new tonight, I would remind you that the Inside Creative Writing homepage through which you accessed this broadcast provides you the opportunity to go back and look at any of the previous evening's work. And not only the evening's work, but replay the full webcast of any given evening's broadcast. So just go to back to the home page, and you go down to the lower half of the page, which has a calendar on it, and you can click on any given evening. You'll see that the evenings, each of them gives you an opportunity to look at the story as it stood at the end of that evening, and also gives you two different connection speeds to access the full webcast for that evening. And you can go back and replay at your leisure the full elaboration of the creative process, which is the point of this whole event. You can also, on that page, find an icon which will allow you to simply go and play the whole story, show the whole story as it exists right this moment when I begin to write tonight. And very importantly, you can go there and click on an icon to email me. And I urge you to do that with any questions you might have about the creative process, about creative writing, about decisions that I'm making as I go in the story. Anything that you want to ask or comment on, and be happy to entertain those comments, with the one exception that since the creation of a work of literary art is not a collaborative process, I ask you not to offer suggestions of what to do next. But any kind of hindsight inquiries you would like to make, feel free to do that. Also, you will find, by the way, some of you may be not terribly familiar with the intricacies of the real player and a webcast. When your real player image comes up on your screen, it will be a certain rather small size. It's the smallest size of three available sizes. It's also the best resolution, ironically, so that as the image gets bigger, I say ironically, but only those of us who are still a little baffled by the technology, I suppose it's perfectly obvious to those who are attuned to these things that the larger the image gets, the worse the resolution gets. But for those of you who feel you're locked into that tiny image, you are not. Just go up to the toolbar up there and go to View, click on that, and then go down to Zoom. And you will see three options come up. One of them, the smallest option, and then there's a way to make the image be about half your screen size, and then a way to make it your full screen size. Once you make it your full screen size, the only way back to making it smaller is to right-click. Use that right button on your mouse, and then you'll be given those options again. So you may want to take that advantage of that if you've been watching it on the smallest size and not seeing a way out of that. And one last thing then, the story began as probably most of you know by now, because it is a Friday evening, and I recognize and I appreciate that I'm talking now to the hardcore. It's a beautiful fall evening here in Tallahassee, and I think it is around the country. I don't know what the weather's like in Brazil, where we have quite a few, surprising several viewers, but for you to spend a Friday evening with me live, I think is a testament to your dedication to becoming an artist. But be that as it may, since there may be someone new out there, a reminder that if you, again, on that Inside Creative Writing homepage, you click on the image of the postcard there, of that fragile little biplane, you will see not only the front of that card, but also the back of the card, which contains the message written on the back of this real photo postcard taken by the guy who observed this plane. And it says, "This is Earl Sant of Erie, Pennsylvania, in his aeroplane just before it fell." And it's this image and these words that has inspired the short story that I am well into now. So let's now return to the story. And as most of you know, I like to begin by reading the story as it now stands. I'm just untangling myself from the microphone wire here. This is not, that kind of little leg dance is not part of the creative process for me. It may be for some, but not for me. All right. I've seen a man die, but not like this. There was silence suddenly around us when he disappeared beyond the trees. By the way, we have now about 1,150 words written. And I am going to start from the beginning and read this through. As you've been following this, you know I do a fair amount of reading aloud. I do this whatever kind of narrator I've got, but the first person narrator particularly is a matter of getting into the voice, into the sensibility of the character. And at some point, I probably will, once we get 2,000 or 3,000 words in, certainly, I will probably stop reading it from the beginning, especially if I feel that the beginning is pretty solid and pretty finely edited and polished, which I'm beginning to feel about a fair number of the words here at the beginning, pretty far in. But eventually then I will, and this is of course what I do when I write a novel, because I do as much reading aloud then as well, but I do not always, every night or every day, return to the beginning to read all the way through. And since we are here at the outset, I think it might be helpful to you to understand a little bit of what's going on off camera. We have focused almost entirely on what's happened here in these 2 hours that we spend together. And then I spend focused entirely on the writing. And in the privacy of my own writing room, a sense of which we're trying to give you here in this broadcast. Needless to say, I'm not talking to myself, but also there is the work spills over in certain non-focused ways outside of the 2 hours in the writing space. I live, this office is on the Florida State University campus, as I've said, which is in Tallahassee, Florida. I happen to live, the house I own is out in Jefferson County. This is Leon County. I'm probably, I'd say about 24, 25 miles from my desk at home at this moment. And I drive in every evening now to do the work here for you, with you. And the drive inevitably begins the evening for me, in a sense. I don't make notes, and I don't necessarily all the time. Although sometimes I do consciously turn my attention and the flow of words in my head, the flow of, I say thoughts, but they're not as much thoughts as impressions, intuitions, daydreams. That flow of stuff in my consciousness is beginning certainly when I'm driving in. And I have a hunch that it never really stops. My suspicion is that on some level, especially once I'm writing a project, certainly then, but I even think between projects, part of me is always wanting to write. And if I have finished a story or a novel, on some level, something gets engaged right away. I'm not really conscious of that for a long while. But I'm pretty convinced, just intuitively and with some circumstantial evidence to suggest it, I'm pretty convinced that my artistic unconscious is active most of the time. But particularly now when I drive in, it's a pastoral drive. I live out in the countryside, notched into a kind of forested area. And the road I take in, though it's not a 2-lane highway, it has a median, 4 lanes, but it's not a interstate either. And it moves through kind of rolling, mostly piney, forested area. You see deer along the road and occasional armadillo carcass. And now that daylight savings time has come on, I drive in certainly in the dark. And tonight, I know that I was feeling some parts of this story shaping up. I'm expecting tonight to know something and encounter through our narrator, who I still feel is now named Paul. Paul will encounter his wife. Last night we ended with him seeing her up ahead in the yard. And honestly, on the drive-in, I at some point pressed my daydream forward toward her. But it's interesting. I have no real strong impressions of her yet. She will begin to exist for me once I am in my full trance and once Paul approaches her and she begins to speak. It seems to me that I know very little clearly about my characters until the moment within the object when they are engaged. And so she still waits. Very much a mystery to me. Now to go back then, and let's do tonight as I say, and this may not happen every night from now on, but I do want to go back to the very beginning tonight. I've seen a man die, but not like this. There was silence suddenly around us. when he disappeared beyond the trees. Silence after terrible sounds. That hammering of his engine, the engine of his aeroplane, and the other sound after. He had climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men. My son cried out too. Hooray, we cried. And Earl Sant hammered overhead and down to the far edge of the pasture, defying the trees, defying the earth. What's made me pause now is the uniform reaction of all of the observers. The hooray. They all take off their hats and shout hooray. But something is going on in Paul in the presence of this airplane that may well not be part of what is going on in many of the others, or in his son even. Hooray, a simple hooray, now strikes me as not precise enough, at least for Paul. Okay, so I need to engage this. And as you know, I like to play music. I'm still with Matthew Arnold's Third Symphony over here. I think that's touching some of the right emotional spots in me. I'm working here trying to make... I'm feeling him out of phase with the mood of this crowd, that there's something going on in him different. And trying to make that distinction. Okay. Right. The sound feels like sport. Now we are 1913. I've got a feeling of a little research coming on here. I printed out the those web pages that we found on the first night. On the first night we went after Earl Sant. And I just want to see, now Earl Sant was barnstorming. And I take this to be his death, and someone remarked, right, his death came when he was flying for a town near what is now known as Grove City. Ooh, Grove City, what now is known as Grove City. You know, I don't need to name the town, but I would like to just, and I'm not beholden to that literal thing, so I'm going to the atlas. I want to see where Grove City, Pennsylvania is. WI3, okay. It's in northwestern Pennsylvania. So, yeah, he's kind of, it could have been equidistant between, I'm trying to figure out if he'd be a Pirates fan or a Cleveland Indians fan. But Grove City is just about, well, it's, yeah. He's closer to Pittsburgh. So Honus Wagner looks like the right choice. Now I'm almost certain that Honus Wagner, the Pirates I think won the World Series in 1909, and Wagner was the star. But I just want to make sure. Let's see, there is a site called Total Baseball. I don't know if it's around anymore. I just want to make sure that Wagner was that's not it. I don't think that's around anymore. Let's just do this directly. Let's go after Honus Wagner here. And he could, official Honus Wagner site. I used Google. Google is the best of the browsers, or the search engines. Absolutely. He broke into the majors in 1897, so 1913. I think he played 20 years. Sure. just not clear enough. I just want to make sure. Okay, 21-year career. 1897. That's 1918. So in 1913, the Flying Dutchman was still playing. Good. I'm also pleased that another little touch of the era is present. It's a period piece, certainly. I'm looking, of course, for the universal things in the work, in this work, but it's good to evoke the period that you're in if it's tied to that, and so it is very clearly. All right, back to work. Shout is a different valence, and I think I can get away with the repetition here. Hooray, they cried. My son cried out too. They waved their hats in the cry. It's a different form of the verb and of the word, and I think it'll work okay. I think I'm ready to read again, though. Let's start this over. I've seen a man die, but not like this. There was silence suddenly around us when he disappeared beyond the trees. Silence after terrible sounds, that hammering of his engine, the engine of his aeroplane, and the other sound after. He had climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men. Mine as well. Hooray, they cried, the others. My son cried out too, hooray. They waved their hats in the cry as if they'd just seen Honus Wagner double down the left field line. I held my hat tight against my chest. Oops. And I was silent. My hat had come off, I realized, from some other impulse. He climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men, mine as well. Hooray, they cried, the others. My son cried out too, hooray. They waved their hats in the cry as if they'd just seen Honus Wagner double down the left field line. I held my hat tight against my chest, and I was silent. My hat had come off, I realized, from some other impulse. though I did not know what that was. My hat had come off, I realized, from some other impulse. Waved their hats in the cry as if they'd just seen Honest Wagner double down the left field line. I held my hat tight against my chest, and I was silent. My hat had come off, I realized, from some other impulse, though I did not know what that was. I did not know what that was. I could not say what that was. I could not say what that was. He had climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men, mine as well. Hooray, they cried, the others. My son cried out too, hooray. They waved their hats in the cry as if they'd just seen Honus Wagner double down the left field line. I held my hat tight against my chest, and I was silent. My hat had come off, I realized, from some other impulse, though I could not say what that was. And Earl Sant hammered overhead and down to the far edge of the pasture, defying the trees, defying the earth. The propeller of his engine spun behind him, and he sat in a rattan chair, as if he was on his front porch smoking a cigar. Then he came back from the tree line, heading our way. I reached out and touched my son on the shoulder. I had never seen an aeroplane, and I confess it scared me some. Good. Now, that's good. The fright had taken, there was the discrepancy. I had him shouting hooray with all the other men. And it didn't feel right, and indeed, he ended up in a different moment later on. It wasn't just his coming back this way, though that certainly heightens the fear, but he's been fearful all along. I had no premonition, but I needed to touch my son, and the plane came toward us, and there was a stiff wind blowing. I'm trying to understand him. And I would remind you again, I've reminded you of this every night, that these flow of words, these analytical words that I speak, it sounds like I'm doing literary analysis as I go. I will just remind you again that these words I speak are artificially constructed in order to help you understand the process. I'm giving words to something that don't shape themselves. Not only do they not shape themselves in the speech in the privacy of my study, they do not even shape themselves into thoughts as analytical as these words. Instead, it feels what's going on inside me, and that I then pause and give voice to here. What's going on inside me is a sense that this man and his voice exists outside of me, is trying to speak through me, is trying to make itself known to me. And the discrepancies I feel sometimes in the voice, in a moment, in a detail, in a syntax, in a repetition or whatever, any discrepancies I feel, the moments that don't feel right, I work over with the intent, the desire to hear him better, to see him better, to understand him better. and understand him in a way that's not an analytical way, but rather to understand him better as an image, as a voice, as a sensibility. So please always keep that in mind. And keeping that in mind, now I'm still struggling now with the moment when he becomes afraid. He's not afraid yet. See, I'm considering even going back to exactly what I had to start with, and that's a decision I'm making right now. Initially, his hat came off with everybody else's and with his son, and they all go hooray, like this is a wonderful thing. Yeah, with the spirit of play and of game and of... It's a cry as if Honus Wagner had just doubled down the left field line. And then it's the plane coming back. That frightens him. All right. So do I feel him most accurately rendered if there is the sudden turnaround as the plane comes back? That he goes hooray in the same way the others do, and then the plane is coming back and suddenly there's this darkness that comes upon him? Or is his initial reaction really already somewhat different? Now, I know I have the version that was here to start with, but I want to make a copy now and open up another Word file. I want to I'm going to preserve this version in case I mess it up in going back and trying to fix it. So let's just do that, and I'm going to save that locally here. Well, no, I might as well just... I'm just trying to decide where to go to save this. It's funny how even these here, I've got a thing I call the working file. If you saw my file structure here, these are where my other stories are, postcards, and there are various other things. I still have the file from that's my wife's work, and this is the file that of a previous book, and this is my book coming out, fair warning. But I have a working file, and I want to save this as, good Lord, there we go. I usually just make it an X file, and I did this well before the TV show. So I've made an X file out of this, and now I can work on it without worrying about messing it up and trying to find my way back again. All right. He had climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men, mine as well. Hooray, we cried. I've seen a man die, but not like this. There was silence suddenly around us when he disappeared beyond the trees, silence after terrible sounds, that hammering of his engine, the engine of his aeroplane, and the other sound after. He had climbed miraculously up, and he had circled the field, and all our hats came off as one, us men. Mine as well. Hooray, we cried. My son cried out too. Hooray. We waved our hats in the air as if we'd just seen Honus Wagner double down the left field line. This was why we'd come to this meadow. We would peek into the future, and it would be a glorious thing. And Earl Sant hammered overhead and down to the far edge of the pasture, defying the trees, defying the earth. The propeller of his engine spun behind him, and he sat in a rattan chair as if he was on his front porch smoking a cigar. Then he came back from the tree line, heading our way. I reached down and touched my son on the shoulder. I had never seen an aeroplane, and something was changing in me as it approached. I suppose it scared me some. I had no premonition, but I needed to touch my son at that moment, and the plane came toward us, and there was a stiff wind blowing. The plane bucked a little, like a nervous horse, but Earl Sant kept him steady, kept him coming forward, and I felt us all ready to cheer again. Then there was a movement on the wing, with no particular sound. Still the engine, but there was a tearing away. If I had been Earl Sant, if I had been sitting in that rattan chair and flying above these bared heads, I might have heard the sound and been afraid. I lifted my camera. This had nothing to do with the thing happening on the wing. I was only vaguely aware of it in that moment. I lifted my camera and I tripped the shutter, and here was another amazing thing, it seemed to me. One man was flying above the earth, and with a tiny movement of a hand, another man had captured him. Earl Sant was about to die, but he was forever caught there in that box in my hand. I lowered my Kodak, and for a moment the plane was before me against the sky. It just occurs to me, and as you know, I made a few notes to start with. It occurs to me, now I see he's got to the developing of the photo may well be something that I have to deal with, a way of him dealing with it. Okay. I lowered my Kodak, and for a moment, okay, there was a great fall, blah, blah, blah. There we go. Yes, I lowered my Kodak, and for a moment, the plane was before me against the sky, and all I felt was a thing that I sometimes had felt as a younger man, riding up into the Alleghenies alone. And there would be a turning in the path, and suddenly the trees broke apart, and there was a great falling away of the land. A falling. He fell, Earl Sant. The aeroplane pitched forward, and for a moment it seemed to stop and to hang against the sky. And the engine hammered on, and then it fell, disappearing behind a stand of pine. There was a heavy thump beyond the trees, and I have nothing in my head to compare it to. Not a barn collapsing, not a horse going down, not the dead sugar maple 40 foot high I had felled only yesterday in our yard. This sound was new. And our silence followed. We all of us could not take this in. He had flown, this Earl Sant. He had raised his goggles to his eyes and stepped into his machine, and he had run along the meadow and had lifted into the air, and now I looked into the empty place where he had been only a moment before. In my head I could see once again the two great wings and the spinning of the propeller, and then he was gone. Papa? It was my son's voice drifting up from the silence. I looked into his face, which was lifted to me. It's all right, I said, though I knew it was not. I could feel Matthew's bones beneath my hand, which still lay on his shoulder. He's gone, my son said. I looked to the others. There was a stirring. Mother of God, one man said, and he began to move in the direction of the pines. He was right. We had to do something now. I let go of my son and turned to the place where Earl Sant had vanished. Stay here, I said. We ran, perhaps a dozen of us, across the meadow grass and into the pines, and I could smell burning, and there was smoke up ahead. And I could smell a newly familiar thing, a smell of the automobiles that had come to our town, their fuel. Then we broke into a clearing, and the aeroplane was crumpled up ahead and beginning to burn. I was behind several of the men, and we were in our Sunday clothes. We had left our churches this morning and had come to see the exhibition of this wonderful thing. And now we were stripping off our coats and winding them around our hands and arms to allow us to reach into the flames to bring Earl Sant out. 2 men were ahead of me, already bending to the tangle of canvas and wood and metal and smoke. I felt myself slow and stop. I did not know this man. I had seen him only from afar, only briefly. He had raised his goggles and hidden his eyes, and he had some intent in his head. To fly, of course, and he did. But he was a man, flesh and blood, and he was lying broken now ahead of me. There were others to help him, the ones ahead and others now. The ones ahead and still others now, rushing past me. Still. All right, little crap. There were other things, the ones ahead and still others now, rushing past me. I hesitated. I continued to hesitate. Continued to hesitate. And then I turned away. Matthew had followed me. He was standing a few yards behind in the trees. I lifted my hand to acknowledge him, and I found it swathed in my suit coat, expecting the fire. I moved to my son, unwrapping my arm. The others are helping, I said to him, so he would understand why I had turned away. I want to see, he said. No, Pa. No, I said, firm. I turned him around and we stepped out of the trees into the meadow. I looked once more into the sky where Errol Sant had been. Matthew and I walked from the meadow and through the center of town, passing the Merchants' Bank where I was vice president, and beneath the old growth maples of our street, and we were quiet, my son and I. The meadow, the open sky, all of that was behind us. Then we reached the place along the road where I could see my house ahead. The maple was gone from the front edge of my property, dead from blight and felled by my own hand. I looked away, not wanting to, but I felt suddenly bereft of this tree. I was sorry for its passing, this tree. Matthew broke away from me now, began to run. I looked. His mother was coming down the porch steps. My son ran hard to her, not calling out. She turned her face toward us, saw him approaching, sensing, I think, that something had happened. Okay, I'm ready to go now. Again. The house itself. You'll remember from last night, if you were with me, that we consulted the American Shelter book and found a house that I think is appropriate for Paul to live in. The Georgian Revival House. A house that he would indeed know the details of. The head gone down on one knee suggests that I stopped. My daughter, let's go back. I need to understand this myself at this point. And I would be understanding it intuitively instead of analytically, but let's look at it together. And so I might do this artificial thing. That is the abstracting of this impression. I looked away, not wanting to, but I felt suddenly bereft of this tree. I was sorry for its passing, this tree. Matthew broke away from me now, began to run. I looked. His mother was coming down the porch steps. My son ran hard to her, not calling out. She turned her face toward us, saw him approaching, sensing, I think, that something had happened. I stopped. Still separate from them. My daughter, a tall, gangly girl, my sweet Naomi, emerged from the house. A tall, gangly girl. Normally there would be a comma there after tall, but I like the run of it. A jumbling of a little rushing of his impressions of her. My daughter, a tall, gangly girl, and my sweet Naomi emerged from the house, and for a moment they all three were before me. And the house itself, a fine house, a house we'd lived in for 4 years now, a solid house with its hipped roof and double-windowed dormer and its clapboard siding, the color of the sunlight and the brightness of noon. He's struggling with what he's seen, and it's important for him at the moment to focus on his house and the family within it. My wife had gone down on one knee as Matthew. The head gone down. His attention has moved to the house. And so he misses the gesture itself of his wife. My wife had gone down on one knee as Matthew reached her and he threw his arms around her neck. I knew I should move forward to explain, but what would I say? The maple was gone from the front edge of my property, dead from blight and felled by my own hand. I looked away, not wanting to, but I felt suddenly bereft of this tree. I was sorry for its passing, this tree. Matthew broke away from me now, began to run. I looked. His mother was coming down the porch steps. My son ran hard to her, not calling out. She turned her face toward us, saw him approaching, sensing, I think, that something had happened. I stopped, still separate from them. My daughter, a tall, gangly girl, my sweet Naomi, emerged from the house, and for a moment, they all three were before me in the house itself, a fine house, a house we'd lived in for 4 years now, a solid house with its hipped roof and double-windowed dormer and its clapboard siding, the color of the sunlight and the brightness of noon. My wife had gone down on one knee as Matthew reached her, and he threw his arms around her neck. My wife had gone down on one knee, and Matthew reached her, and he threw his arms around her neck. I knew I should move forward to explain, but what would I say? Naomi came to the two of them, put her arm on her crouching mother's shoulder. There was a seizing in my chest. I wanted to make them all take them all three up into my arms, but instead, I stood there. I stood dumbly there, watching. All right, this is one of those moments, and I think I've mentioned this before, and I may expound on it some night in the question and answer period. But the sense in which fiction writers are what would be directly analogous to movie makers. That sense of things is now very clear here. Literature, the reading of literature in fiction is, fiction, particularly, not so much on poetry, but fiction is a kind of cinema of the mind, or the consciousness. As you read, you see the scenes and the characters before you and moving, and you hear them, and it's a sensual response to the ongoing scene. And as a result, many of the things that we understand as film techniques are directly applicable and analogous to fiction techniques, including what we all know instinctively from seeing so many movies is the cut, and the way one scene will end, and there'll be a cut to the next scene, and we skip over, and it's an elegant transitional device, because our minds put things together. Our reading minds, our sensibilities, they put these things together in a very natural way. You put one thing next to another thing. The great Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein called this the montage effect, where you place one thing next to another thing and a third thing emerges. Putting any two images or any two scenes back to back implies a third thing, a thing that, our perceptions link those two things in some causal way, in some emotionally or psychologically linked way. And now I've got to make a movie-making decision. Does he step forward? And speak to his wife now about what happened? Or do we cut to some later moment in the evening? Implying, though, that the problem is, what does that imply? That he'd said nothing in that time? That's the decision that will be under some agonized silence now for a time. I'm going to put the music back on. And you ponder that with me. Because how do we cut this? Where do we cut now? Or does he move forward? Or do we cut to later in the evening? We must have, this woman in the work now. And he and his wife must deal with this together. And this is major stuff. So I hope we've had very little of the grass growing, watching the grass grow phenomenon in these sessions, although there is a lot of watching the grass grow or feeling the grass grow or listening for the grass growing if you're writing. And this may be one of those moments. I don't know. Now that we're going to have, because there's some basic stuff that I'm going to have to work through. My wife had gone down on one knee, and Matthew reached her and he threw his arms around her neck. I knew I should move forward to explain, but what would I say? Naomi came to the two of them, put her hand on her crouching mother's shoulder. There was a seizing in my chest. I wanted to take them all three up into my arms, but instead I stood dumbly there watching. Finally, Rachel's face lifted to look at me over her son's shoulder. The naming of the principles in this work have always felt important. The moment at which he uses names, as a more and more, the relationship of family, the security of it, the presence of Earl Sant in this man's consciousness, his attachment to his family, and the ways in which he's close to them, feels he needs to be close to them, they demand he's being close to them. In those moments when he withdraws, he feels disconnected. Those things I'm very clearly feeling now are important to. It's important to attend to those moments in which he speaks of anyone by their proper name, by their full name, by their shortened name, by their relationship to others, by pronoun. And here his wife's name is revealed in the moment when she looks up from hearing her son's tale of what has happened, a thing that is profoundly working on our narrator, Paul. And at the moment she looks up, having known something, has happened here, is when he speaks her name. Finally, Rachel's face lifted to look at me over her son's shoulder. Her son sounds unnecessarily cold. Finally, Rachel's face lifted to look at me over Matthew's shoulder. I felt heavy now, rooted to this earth, as if I'd decided to take the place of the dead maple. Another use of that thing that entered the story in one organic way and is continuing to be used. You use the things that are there. Okay, finally Rachel's face lifted to look at me over Matthew's shoulder. I felt heavy now, rooted to this earth, as if I decided to take the place of the dead maple. But I made myself move. I took a step and another, and there was a loosening inside me as I moved toward my family. My wife tilted her head slightly, a questioning gesture, I think. Naomi looked at me too, came around her mother. And I was glad she was drawing near, and she put her arms around me, her bony arms pressing at my back. I held her tight. Felt the bones in her arms pressing at my back. I held her tight. "What is it, Danny?" she said. "An accident," I said. "It was just an accident. Maddie said he was dead, the man." We know who's speaking there, and I've got said. And so I'm going to, "What is it, Daddy?" "An accident," I said. I held her tight. "What is it, Daddy?" So we know who's speaking there. There's no question that it's her voice speaking. So we can take the tag out there and save ourselves a said. "What was it, Daddy?" "An accident," I said. "It was just an accident. Maddie said he was dead, the man. We don't know that for sure. He fell, yes. She said no more, but she needed me to hold her closer, and I did. It's all right, I said. We're all right. Okay. I continue, as you know if you've been with me, I continue to count words. The counting of words is a way for me to keep track not only of my output for the writing evening. There's a little bit of that, but mostly it's a way also of keeping a sense of the proportions of things, the rhythm of things. I know where we started in this scene, and I know we've now spent about 350 words here, which is okay. So I'm going to go back now again and try to see where what's next, whether this scene needs to go on or whether we need to. Now I need to cut to later. I'm not sure of that yet. Now, by the way, I don't always, in the privacy of my own room, I may not read, I do read aloud quite a bit, but I don't read aloud, and I read back over as much as you see me doing here, but I don't read aloud as much as you hear me doing. So, in fact, now, because I really need to get into that dream space without and try to forget you're here for the time being. You'll see me back up here. I want to read this internally and not out loud this time. Sometimes I need to read it aloud, and that's not infrequently. But other times, also not infrequent, I need to read it silently to connect to the voice to come, where the voice is going next, which comes initially in silence, in my literal silence. Now it's interesting. He says we're all right. He doesn't say Earl Santa's all right. He knows he's not. He says we don't know that for sure. Manny said he was dead, the man. We don't know that for sure. He does know. He does know. but he's trying to soften it for his daughter. He fell, yes. It's as if she knows that he's not telling the truth, and acknowledging that he fell is enough. She said no more, but she needed me to hold her closer, and I did. It's all right, I said. We're all right. Does he really feel that they're all right? I don't think so. But that assertion, and why he puts it in terms of them, the fact that he even puts it in terms of them, he raises the question of, shows that he's not certain that they are. And that's where the complexity of this story resides. And it also suggests, that's an interesting, that is that moment of ambiguity. Just want to see if the bowl was on. I thought I accidentally hit it. The bowl was off. That moment of complexity. Feels like the right way to tap. Now to break. This is where the place where you cut throws a very serious attention onto the last thing that happens. It's a little surprising that he says, we're all right. On the face of it, that's not really an issue. It's not really, it's their well-being is not really at stake here on the face of it. And the fact that he asserts that they are all right in response to his daughter, that they are all right, is what I'm saying gets at something which feels important to me. And to tap it, especially since I'm trying to make the decision of whether now somehow he engages his wife there in the front yard or his son or whatever, but because of the resonance of that moment, I think the right decision is to let the scene end there, and I have made that decision by putting in the asterisk. So we're going to line space here, and tomorrow night we will take up the next scene in the house, and then it's got to be an engagement between himself and his wife, between him and his wife. So our word count tonight at the end is 1509. So we've done 359 words tonight, and that's about what we've been averaging in the time that's a lot that this story allows for. Okay, so let me just I've got my questions already. Come on in, Frank. And this is Frank Allen. Thank you so much, Frank. He's one of our graduate students, and I appreciate it. Good. Sorry. Take care. And Frank, of course, as I mentioned last night, is not genuflecting from any sense of the ecclesiastical hierarchy in the program here, but rather so that his face can be on the camera as he gives us the stuff. And by the way, maybe I should elaborate on that. Let me just, first of all, make sure I have saved my work. That is always lesson number one. As you write on a computer, you save frequently. And I have now done that. And we will go to the home page. And one of the first things I want to mention here is it's interesting. The fact that and you must understand that this kind of project has its certain limitations. Your presence here is very real to me, but you are a virtual audience for me. And I believe I mentioned this earlier. I think I did, probably the first night, that when I was beginning, I wrote every word of my first 4 published novels on legal pads by hand on my lap on the Long Island Railroad as I commuted back and forth. And certainly there's a lot of kind of public attention there. I didn't have a lot of people directly watching me, conscious of what I was doing. People minded their own business, more or less, most of the time. By the way, we have a very big sheaf of questions we're gathering up here. But the reason the grad students kneel here is to get on this camera over here. And the reason they have to do that is there is no cameraman in the office with me. These cameras are fixed, will not move. I don't know, necessity breeds, you can do a lot of things when you need to do them that you don't know that you can do. But it would be enormously more difficult for me to carry on this process with you and to write with an audience if there were someone in this office with me, and necessarily then being the cameraman, focused on exactly what I'm doing. I have a hunch that would be significantly more difficult, even perhaps to the point of being impossible. Okay. I passed a question off last night toward the end of our session because it felt to me as if it had some pretty broad implications and I was running out of time. So I want to go back to Ellen Canner's question that we took up from last night. And she says, what role does faith have in pursuing the dreamscape, the unconsciousness? And faith here, I'm not quite sure how Ellen means the word faith, but perhaps asking it in terms of various meanings of the word faith. In terms of and the most meaningful term to me is that you go into your unconscious. And I believe I've quoted Akira Kurosawa to you before, but let me do it again. He says that to be an artist means never to avert your eyes. And that is a very difficult thing because our dream space, our unconscious selves, that place is full of really nasty, difficult, demanding, scary stuff. We spend most of our lives seeking ways of staying out of there. And rightly so. If we lived intensely in our dream space, in our unconscious, all day long, we would go mad. I dare say that much literal insanity, madness, has to do with the inability of some people to turn off the unconscious, to turn off the dream space, to leave the dream space. I also suspect that that the kind of traditional expectation of artists as being a little mad or alcoholic. I think those things are reflections of what I'm talking about here. For many artists, it's difficult. They know, and indeed they are artists because they are able to go into their artistic unconscious, into their dream space, and not avert their eyes and not flinch and create something from there that is deeply rooted in their most essential selves, in the white-hot center of them, in their deepest intuitions about what the world and the universe is about. And they do that for 2 or 3 hours a day in creating their works. But then they have to get up and walk out of the office, and they leave this space, and they have to deal with the other 22 or 23 hours, 21 or 22 hours of their day. And how do they do that? They separated from the act of creation and thrown back out into the quotidian, into the everyday world. If they're not able to just somehow, by some force of will, turn off that connection to their unconscious, then they're up against it. They manifest the symptoms of madness. They seek the release and escape of alcohol or drugs or whatever other intense sensual diversions there are available in the world. But it is an act of faith then, isn't it? For all of us. To go into that very demanding and difficult and challenging place and expect to open ourselves up to those deep sense-based longings and passions and fears and horrors and tremblings and also joys. It's not all bad. I stress the horrors of the unconscious only because that's the aspect that wants to keep you out of it. That's why much of your writing, if you're an inexperienced writer, comes from the head. That's why you will things in stories in the beginning. That's why you're anxious to analyze. That's why you skirt around and leave out the yearning of the characters that you write about. Because it's safe that way. Because you protect yourself that way. And maybe it's a failure of faith. Maybe faith is the essence, Ellen. That you have to go into that unconscious with the faith that you can do it, that you can articulate this intense vision that you have there, and that you can come back out of it again and remain whole. And that takes faith. And the faith can reside in whatever force makes sense to you, whether it's a kind of religious faith or a faith in art or a faith in some less focused belief in the universe or whatever. I mean, a faith in the the vision you've been given from whatever quarter that you may not ask yourself where it comes from. You just know that you have to go there and articulate it. If you don't have faith, you will avert your eyes. And you'll fail as an artist. Andy Pizzi, Andy Pizzi of Tallahassee, Florida asks, when you begin to write a story, what is your decision process on whether to write in the first person or the third person? Well, Andy, that decision, like every other decision in the creation of a work of art, is not a decision made independent of everything else. The correct person you write in is as much an organic decision as everything else. And it's hard for me to lay down, and maybe counterproductive, and abstract guidelines for that. Certainly, the first-person voice places you, binds you into the sensibility of the character whose voice you're writing in. You cannot step back from that voice outside of the character and draw in things that the character herself is not able to perceive. Now, there may be the use of dramatic irony, and often is, wherein the way you create the object, the reader may know more than the character knows. But there is still a severe, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, there is a frame, let's say, around that point of view, beyond which you cannot go. Now, if your vision of the world in a given story or novel calls for that kind of perception, it also, though, gives you more direct access to voice, of the voice of the character. The third-person narrator can often draw near to the main character's voice, but oftentimes, but can't do so in some absolute way, and will often have to pull back out, just rhythmically. And so the first person does offer advantages as well. Each first person, third person have separate advantages. Obviously, the third person then works in a story or a novel where the vision of the work, the organically whole, everything resonating and everything vision of that object that's been created, is best rendered with the opportunities of moving back from the main character and clearly seeing and articulating the things outside of that character's purview. So it's always, Andy, dictated from within the work. And that decision is made on that basis and not as a kind of analytical or willed decision outside of those things. Frank from Cairo, Georgia says, I guess it's Cairo. It's Cairo, Illinois, and I believe it's Cairo, Georgia, isn't it? Frank says, last night you mentioned oral interpretation. Would you please explain what that is? Well, I was an oral interpretation major at Northwestern University as an undergraduate. And in retrospect, I think that that is a remarkably good discipline for an undergraduate student to take if you want to be a fiction writer. Oral interpretation is a mode of literary examination and analysis that is based on the premise that all literature, and indeed all writing, it has within it a persona. Every work, written work, has a persona in it narrating the work. That is, there is in any accumulation of written words an implied speaker who has a discernible personality, a discernible self, and is discernible through traditional modes of literary analysis, but also by a careful examination of voice and understanding and reading the subtextual implications, the implications of personality that reside in the usage of words, choices of words in various contexts, the modes of speech, the syntax, the rhythms of things. All of this implies a personality. And the oral interpreter looks at literature from a traditional analytical point of view, as a literature student might, but also, and primarily then, uses that analysis as a handmaiden to the primary analysis of voice and of the persona of the work. And as I said, any kind of writing is accessible to this sort of examination. I took courses in oral interp of biography and history. The biographer and the historian. Also, any writing, as I said last time, your cereal box in the morning has a personality implicit in the voice. So the oral interpreter examines that voice, understands the personality within it, and then literally embodies that voice in performance. In the reading aloud of literature, the kind of thing, by the way, this is a secondary benefit for fiction writers because we're all often put in a place, a situation where in a bookstore or in a university or somewhere you read. You often find yourself reading aloud from your own work. And that kind of oral performance from literature is a thing that oral interp is based on. But it's based on it in order to get at and understand, and even then, therefore, in a sense, in a way, in a sensual way, in an indirect, artistic way, even comment on, and in a kind of literary critical way, comment on the work. Now, the benefits to an aspiring fiction writer, I think, are pretty clear. Because you learn how to inhabit your narrative voice. And I mean inhabit quite literally. You live within your narrative voice. You learn how to be responsive to your own voice at all times. You learn where to place your focus of concentration. And that's often a tricky thing. The focus of concentration as you're writing, these times when I turn my music on and I start letting the words flow out, I have to locate myself somehow. I have to locate my being, my consciousness within me. And oral interp helps you learn how to do that because it's the same locus that gives you access to the personality of the voice and where you perform from in the public performance aspects of oral interp. So that's oral interpretation, and as I say, I think it's a wonderful discipline. If you don't major in it, at least take some courses in it while you pursue whatever else. It's a great training for writers. Jimmy from Columbia, South Carolina asks, you talked about the state of self-loathing before you begin new stories. You also talked about the artistic necessity of working every day. Are you then working on something while the seed for the next is gestating? In other words, doesn't that self-loathing interfere with whatever story you're working on? If you're not working on one story as the next waits, what do you do to stay in the habit? Okay, it's an interesting question. I don't know, and I think I have tried to do, in fact, two things at once. I write screenplays too. I've written 7 or 8 screenplays now for half a dozen different Hollywood studios for hire, not of my own stuff and not original screenplays. They hire me to write screenplays out of other people's material or other ideas or biographies or whatever. None of it's been made yet, which is not surprising in the world of screenwriting. But I thought screenwriting is an art form where the writer is not, there's an awful lot of external forces coming to bear on you, and you make decisions within the script not necessarily from your own artistic unconscious. It's a different art form, and it's a collaborative art form. But I thought, even given that I could write fiction in the morning and screenplays in the afternoon. It's never worked out. I find I have to work on only one thing at a time. I think your artistic and conscious really can focus on one thing at a time. You can't, by analogy or metaphor, you can't dream 2 dreams at once. So I suspect, and I don't have a definitive answer for this, Jimmy, because who knows what's going on in the very depths of your unconscious. Certainly, there are things that have been working in there that are kind of put aside while the thing I'm writing is going. In between times, you don't have to write every day. When I say you have to write every day, that's when you're working on the thing at hand. In between, you do not end one thing and the next morning pick up the next thing. So the writing every day, I may have been it might have been slightly ambiguous about that. I do not mean to say that to be a fiction writer, the day you finish one short story, you have to the next day begin a new one. There is time in between. That's when the self-loathing comes in. And then I think your unconscious goes back to things that it had been working on. I think in the periods where you're not writing, I think indeed your unconscious is working on a number of things at once. Then one thing presents itself, that's what's going to be the thing to work on. And while you're doing that, I believe it's pretty single-minded, your unconscious. And after that, then, in between again, I think you're back to probably working on a number of things at once at that very deep level, and until something shapes itself up enough to write. Well, Andy Pizzi writes another question to us. When you begin to write a short story, what is your decision process on whether to write in the first person or third person? Oh, that's the same question I just asked. I am currently struggling with this decision, though not of a story from a postcard, but of pictures from my past. Well, I answered the same question twice, but Andy, I think that if you are working from photographs of your past, you probably also need to be very careful if you want to create a work of art. Be very careful that you don't get bound in by literal memory. If the images are from your past, and where first and third person, Andy, is a decision you're going to need to make within the organic context of your story. But the other thing that you really need to very consciously take care of is not to go to the places that you still remember. If the pictures are from your past, and that's just a kind of externalization from what all of you may be working with, you need to remember what Graham Greene once said, who's the great British novelist. He said, all good novelists have bad memories. He says, what you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes in compost of the imagination. And the reason I botched that quote just now, and it's not even a quote anyway, I'm just paraphrasing him, is I can't remember the quote. My memory is terrible in those kind of quotidian ways, and that's good. Good novelists have bad memories. What you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes into the compost of the imagination. Since the object is organic, and since everything resonates into everything else in a work of art, the thing that sits in the story and will not yield is going to destroy the structure, is going to destroy the object. How many times have I heard in workshops where a criticism is made and the young writer says, well, something doesn't ring true or something is wrong with it, and they say, well, that's the way it really happened. Well, see, that's the problem. It's only the things that you've forgotten that you can write from. The things that have broken themselves down into their essential, sensual parts. That's where you write. That dream space certainly has been shaped by all of the experiences of your life. It is your white-hot center. But it's white-hot because it's a flame. It's burning. The particularities, the literalness of your past has already gone up in flames, and it's now creating heat and light, and it's energizing you, and it's sensual. And when you create the invented thing, its essence comes from your life, but its details do not in a direct way. And so it's important that you forget. It's important that you put enough time, both physical time and emotional time, between yourself and your past. It's a paradox. The closer you get to your most essential and deepest self, the farther you get away from the limitations, the boundaries, and the particularities of your past as it was actually lived. So I'm glad, at least the second time around on Andy's question, that you mentioned that, because I think that's an important point. Well, we're out of time again tonight. These 2 hours go very quickly. Thank you for joining me. Tomorrow night, Saturday, we'll all take a break. And please rejoin me Sunday evening at the same time for another episode of Inside Creative Writing. And we'll see where the story leads us. Thank you very much. And good night.